So I'm Jeff Brown, and I work for SpringSource on the Grails development team. I spend most of my time working on the Grails framework and helping folks solve problems with Grails. I really am excited about Grails. I think Grails is, one thing is it's a lot of fun to work with, and people tell me that all the time. Folks will start doing development with the Grails framework and tell me exactly that Grails makes web development fun again. Grails offers developer productivity gains that mean you can build sophisticated, complicated, serious enterprise web applications much quicker than you can with lots of other, say, Java web frameworks. So first, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. My name is Jeff Brown, and I work for SpringSource. I work on the Grails development team. So I spend most of my time working on the Grails framework or helping people solve problems with Grails. Of course, SpringSource is the company behind both Groovy and Grails. Groovy and Grails are both open source and both free software, but we provide commercial services around that software. We provide support and training and some consulting services and so forth. So I'm going to spend almost all my time talking about the technology here. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking to you about SpringSource and our services, but just I do want to mention that, point out that SpringSource is the company behind both Groovy and Grails. And if you need any sort of professional services help around the technology, we're happy to help you solve whatever problems we can. So let's just get into the technology. The whole session is going to be a coding session. We're done with the slides, unless you've got questions, right? So what this is about is I'm going to start completely from scratch. I've got no code at all. We're going to write the entire application from zero. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build a Twitter clone with the Grails framework. And part of the reason that we put this presentation together is a lot of Grails introductory demos all look the same, and that is someone will create a Grails application and create one or two domain classes and generate some scaffolding and demonstrate how easy it is to get a CRUD application up and running with Grails. And it's very, very easy to do that. You can create a CRUD application in 2 or 3 minutes and be talking to a real database and doing some pretty interesting things in just a few minutes. But all of those introductory demos look the same. And there's a small component of that in what I'm going to demonstrate here. What I want to do is sort of wander off into more than just a simple CRUD application. We're going to take advantage of technologies like JMS for asynchronous messaging. We're going to use implement some really interesting search capabilities in our application. We'll use a really powerful caching mechanism called Gemfire. We'll use Spring Security to do some interesting things. What I want to do is demonstrate that all the really cool things that people see in Grails when they see that Hello World CRUD demo, all the simplicity that you see in that demo, that same kind of simplicity shows up all over the place in the Grails framework. If any of you have done, JMS is a good example. If you've done any JMS work with Java, you know there's a certain amount of sort of complexity in making that happen. We're going to see that in just a couple lines of code, we can do some pretty interesting things with JMS in the context of a Grails app. And JMS is just one example of that. Grails really, really does simplify the process of building serious enterprise web applications for the JVM. And hopefully, by the end of this session, you'll have at least a sense for what a lot of that looks like within the context of a Grails app. So I'm going to start at the very, very beginning. You have to have no Grails experience at all to follow along here. What I'm going to do, this first 5 minutes, once I start writing code, is going to be pretty lightning fast. I'm going to do some things really, really quickly. Just bear with me. We'll quickly get to a point where I can slow down and start talking about some really interesting capabilities provided by the framework. But this first 5 minutes is going to go, just hold on tight. We'll get through this quickly. So where I'm at right now, and definitely speak up. If you've got questions, get my attention, raise your hand, yell something. Speak up if you've got questions as we're moving along here. I'm in a brand new directory I just created a few minutes ago, and it's empty. There's nothing in this directory at all. And I'm going to create a brand new Grails application called SF Twitter. All right, so I've typed Grails create app SF Twitter. And what Grails is doing right now is creating my project for me. Everything that I need to build my application and test my application and run the application will be in place here in just a moment. All right, so I typed Grails create app, And this SF Twitter directory was just created. And in this directory, let me open this up and show you some of the things that are here already. Every single Grails application on the planet, without exception, every Grails application there is structured just like this. So at the top of the project is a directory called Grails-App. Below Grails App are a number of directories with names like controllers and domain and services and taglib and so forth. There's a place for controllers in a Grails app. So this controllers directory is where all of your controllers live. So we're going to create a controller and put it in that directory. There's a place for all of your domain classes, and that place is this domain directory. So that's really, really useful. When I come out to a client site and they need help solving some problem with their Grails application and they give me a copy of their code, I don't need to read their project documentation or talk to their tribal leaders or anything like that to figure out things like where are your controllers and where are your services. I know exactly where they are because they're in the same place in every single Grails application, right? So these directories, most of them are empty right now. The controllers directory is empty, the domain directory is empty, the services directory is empty. We're going to create some things in each of those directories as we move along here. All right, I'm going to install a plugin into my Grails application, and I'm going to install Spring Security Core with an O, not a 0. Spring Security Core. So that is, there are lots and lots of plugins available for Grails. If we go out and look at our public plugin repository right now, there are 500 and something plugins out there. The plugin story is an important part of the Grails story. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the plugin system tonight, but we are going to use a number of plugins, and the Spring Security plugin is one of them. So what I just did is I typed Grails install plugin and then the name of a plugin. The name is Spring Security Core in this case. And a number of interesting things happen in my project that relate to a number of things are being provided by that plugin. We're going to stumble across those as we move along and start writing some more code. One of the things that was contributed by that plugin is a new command called S2 Quick Start. And we see that, my mouse go right here. This is a new command that has been contributed by that plugin, S2-Quick Start. And you wouldn't know this other than, the way you would discover this is by reading the plugin documentation. But what that script does is it makes it easy to get started. If I type org grails twitter.auth, that's the name of a package, could be anything. This is the name of a class that I want to use to represent persons in my security system. So I'm going to call the class person. And another class name I'll call authority. What I'm doing is I'm specifying three things here, a package and two class names. The first class name, person, is the name of the class that we're going to use to represent people in our system. So I'll call that class person. And authority is the name of the class that I'm using to represent authorities or roles in my application. So we're only going to have one kind of person in our simple Twitter demo. It's going to be just a user. But we could have lots of different kinds of users. We could have a user, an administrator, HR, whatever. So the Spring Security plugin is very, very flexible and supports a role-based authentication and lots of interesting things. But we're going to be able to take advantage of Spring Security without knowing much at all about Spring Security. So we'll see what that looks like in code as we get going here. So one of the things that was just created is this class right here, which is called person. So under domain, we've got org, Grails, Twitter, auth, and person.groovy. That was just created when I typed Grails S2 quick start and the command arguments that I just described a while ago. And I'm going to add one property to this class. So what this class looks like right now, this is what the plugin by default gives you to represent users. So users have usernames and passwords, and they can be enabled and so forth. You see all the properties there that describe a user. I'm going to add one more property called real name, because I want users to have a username and a real name. So my username might be Jeff, but my real name is Jeff space Brown. So I've just added another property here that I want to associate with users. I'm going to add some code to my Bootstrap class here. So under Grails App /conf is a file called bootstrap.groovy. And there are two properties in this bootstrap.groovy class. There's an init property and a destroy property. The init block is executed when the container is starting up your Grails application. So what I want to do every time the application starts up is I want to check to see if there are any persons in the database. And if there are not, I want to create some kind of dummy data for us to work with. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about this. Just know that when I start up the application, this code gets executed. And what this code is doing is creating some data in my database so I'll be able to log into the application. And we'll talk more about that Spring Security Service property in just a bit. And I need to import org.grails.twitter.auth.star because we're referring to classes like person and person authority and so forth that are in that package. All right, and one more thing that I need to update is there's a file under Grails App /conf called config.groovy. And what I'm doing here, we're going to come back to this code that I just now added here and talk in more detail about that later. But that's all the code I want to write for now. By the way, we're almost to the end of that dizzying part that I mentioned earlier. We're going to slow down, and this is I promise this is going to get interesting quickly here. So I've just typed Grails space run app at the top of my project. And what run app is doing is building my application and then starting up an instance of Tomcat and then configuring my application in that instance of Tomcat. Important to note is that I don't have to install and configure Tomcat ahead of time. All I have to install is Grails, and Grails bundles a version of Tomcat and a bunch of other dependencies. But when I type Grails run app, you don't necessarily have to know this. It could be any servlet container, but what's happening is we're starting up an instance of Tomcat, right? So Tomcat's running right now. We don't have to monkey with configuring any of that. It just works. So let's point our browser at this URL and see what we've got so far. And this is just the default welcome page for a Grails application. Of course, you'll change this and make it look like whatever your application needs to look like. Right now, our application has just two controllers in it. And that is, there's a login controller and a logout controller. And those are both contributed by the Spring Security plugin. Right? So if I go to the login controller and I type Jeff, and I'm just going to type some gibberish right there and click login, it's going to say, nope, that's no good. But if I type Jeff and password, that should work. And it turns out that code that I put in the Bootstrap class earlier is creating a user whose name is Jeff, and the password is password. And there are a number of other users. So there's really nothing interesting we can do in the application yet. All we can do is log into the application and log out. We can't even tell that we're logged in or logged out yet. But we've got some security infrastructure in place to help us start building some interesting capability into our application. All right, so let's start building some real domain logic here. So I want to create a new domain class that I'll call org.grails.twitter.status. Right? When you use Twitter, you post status messages, right? That's what Twitter's all about, is keeping track of these status messages. So I'm going to create a class to represent one of those status messages. So I've typed Grails create domain class and then the name of the class that I want to create. So if we look at status.groovy now, a status has a message associated with it, right? So whatever you type into Twitter when you post update, whatever you've typed in, that's going to be the message property. In addition to that, we need to know who authored this particular message, right? Twitter has millions and millions of messages posted every day, and every one of them has a user associated with them. So we want to associate every one of these status messages with a person. That's the person class that we looked at earlier. And I need to import that class. Just import the whole package. And then finally, I want to add one more property to this class called dateCreated. So every status messages has three properties associated with it. It has the message, that is whatever you typed into Twitter. It has a person associated with it. That's whoever posted this particular message. And it has a date associated with it that represents when was this status message posted. Right? Questions about any of that stuff so far? Is good? All right. So let's create a controller for org.grails.twitter.status. So I created a domain class before. Now I'm creating a controller. This is the domain class. The domain class has three properties. Domain classes are things that are persisted to the database. So I can create one of these things and save it to the database. And we'll see what that code looks like in just a bit. But that's what domain classes are. They're classes that you will create instances of and persist to the database. And what makes this a domain class is the fact that it's declared under the domain directory. So right here, if I zoom in a little bit here, under Grails App /domain, right down here, we've got org, Grails, Twitter, and then status is in the Twitter directory. The fact that these classes are declared underneath this domain directory makes them domain classes. How many of you have written Hibernate applications? Most people? Yeah, almost everyone. So typically, when you're writing a Java application and you're going to use Hibernate to persist objects to the database, right? Hibernate's a really, really powerful ORM tool. In a typical Java application, you write your entities that you want to persist to the database, and then you have to tell Hibernate about those entities. So one way you could do that is by writing those Hibernate XML config files. Or you could annotate your classes with @entity and use JPA annotations or Hibernate annotations. But one way or the other, you've got to tell Hibernate about your domain class. You have to tell Hibernate which of your classes you want mapped to the database. In Grails, that's the covers. We're using Hibernate, but you very seldom will you write any Hibernate code. And we get to skip that step of configuring Hibernate. You don't have to tell Hibernate which of your classes are mapped to the database. You kind of do and you kind of don't. The way you tell Hibernate which of your classes should be mapped to the database is all of the classes that are declared under the domain directory are automatically mapped to the database. So there's no XML files, there's no annotations. This class will be mapped to the database using Hibernate because it's declared under the domain directory. Right, so that's an example of convention over configuration. We followed a convention, and because we followed that convention, we've done away with potentially significant configuration work. And that idea of convention over configuration shows up all over the place in the Grails framework. We'll see lots of examples of that in the demo that I'm going to work through here. All right, so in addition to our domain class, we've got a controller now, org, Grails, Twitter, status controller. And underneath our views directory is a directory called status. In that directory, I'm going to create a file called index.jsp. And we'll come back to that code in just a minute. I just want to start our application up and see what we've got so far. So I stopped our application before so I could create some new artifacts and make some changes. We're starting the application back up right now. Grails is building the app. Tomcat is starting right now. As soon as Tomcat's up and running, all the plugins will be initialized. So the Spring Security plugin is being initialized right now, and it's doing a bunch of things under the covers. And now our application's back up and running. And now we see we've got 3 controllers in our application. The login and logout controllers were there before. In addition to that, we've got this status controller. And when I visit that status controller, we'll fill the details relevant to this in just a minute, but let me get rid of that for a moment. There we go. When I visit that status controller, we see this. So what's happening right here is I sent a request to sftwitter/status/index. So sftwitter is just the name of our application. The interesting stuff starts after that. So status/index tells Grails, at least by default, you get to change this, but by default what that means is execute the index action in the status controller. Execute the index action in the status controller. So if we go look at the index action in the status controller, right now it's empty. It doesn't do anything. We're going to add some code to that in just a moment, but the action doesn't do anything. When a controller action is executed, one of the things that can happen is if the controller, let's just say the controller doesn't do anything. That's the case right now. The controller action is not doing anything. What's going to happen is Grails is going to render a view, and we haven't told Grails what view to render. So it's going to render a view. It's going to select a view by convention, and the convention is a view whose name matches this action name will be rendered. So since the action is called index, Grails is going to look for a view called index, and this GSP that I created is called index.gsp. So this view is being rendered. This GSP page is what we're looking at right here, where it says, what are you doing up at the top, and we see an update status button at the bottom. Right here is the what are you doing heading, and right here is the button that says update status, and I can put any valid market. So I just added San Francisco there. We'll refresh this, and we see San Francisco. So this GSP is being rendered when we send a request to /status/index. This GSP doesn't have a whole lot in it right now. It's got the heading that I just pointed out and changed, and it's also got a form in it. Notice on line 10, we're invoking a tag called form remote. And so Grails provides a whole lot of GSP tags. There are two form tags in particular. One is just called form, and one is called form remote. And the difference between them is the form tag creates an HTML form, and form remote creates an AJAX form. What I want to happen, and this isn't going to work yet, but what I want to happen when I type something in here and click update status is what should happen is that should create a new status object where the person associated with that status object is me, right, the currently authenticated user. The message is whatever I've typed into this, this text area here, and the date created is right now. So what we want to happen when I click update status is create a new status and populate all three of those fields, the message, the date created, and the author of that message. So let's figure out what it takes to make all of that happen. So this form remote tag creates an AJAX form. The URL attribute of the form remote tag tells the form remote tag where to submit this AJAX request to. So when the form is submitted, Grails is trying to execute an action called update status. And there is no update status action, and that's why we get a 404 here. Notice it's looking for status/update status. So if we were to go to our status controller and add an action called update status, I'm going to put that there for a moment. Bear with me. So I've got an action in my controller now called update status. Let's go back to our application. And I'll fill this in and click update status. And we see it worked. Right? It didn't do anything useful yet, but we're not getting a 404 anymore. Right? When I fill out this form and click update status, what's happening is a request is being sent to the status controller. In particular, a request is being sent to the update status action. The message that we typed in is being sent to the controller, but we're not doing anything with it yet. But we've got at least the very basic interaction between our, we can fill out the form and click submit and something happens. So we need to make more interesting things happen now. Remember what I really want to happen is something like this. So what that's doing, on line 8 there, I'm creating a new status object, and I'm initializing the message property in that status object to be params.message. And if you look around this controller, you don't see params declared any place. But in a controller, you can always refer to a variable called params. And what params will be is it's a map that includes all the request parameters that were part of this HTTP request. So it turns out that in our form, we've got a text area whose name is message. So that's the text area where you're typing in your new status message. So params.message is going to be whatever the user typed into the form there, right? We'll come back to this status.author in just a minute. So I created a status object, and I want to save it. I want to persist that thing to the database. So we're invoking the save method on an instance of the status class. If we go back and look at our status class, there is no save method. In fact, there are no methods. And just to be clear, we can get rid of this constraints block. There is no save method in the status class, but this code is valid. And what that will do is save the object to the database. The status object will, in fact, be persisted to the database. When Grails starts up, Grails is doing a whole lot of things as it bootstrapped your application. But one of the things that Grails is doing is finding all of your domain classes and doing a bunch of things to those domain classes. Groovy makes it really, really easy to add methods to classes at runtime. That's something we don't think about doing in Java because you can't do that in Java. But in Groovy, that's trivial. And in fact, that's an important part of building applications with Groovy is taking advantage of that kind of dynamic behavior. So one of the things that Grails does at application bootstrap time is we find all of your domain classes and add a save method to all of them. So if you create an instance of a domain class, you can call .save on it, and that object will be saved to the database. So you don't have to write any of that code typically. So we need to, in addition to initializing that message property, we also need to initialize the author property of this status object. And I'm going to do that with a call to Lookup Person. I'm going to declare a property here, like that. All right. So on line 5, I've declared a property whose name is Spring Security Service. The Spring Security plugin adds a bean to the Spring application context whose name is Spring Security Service. And that bean does some interesting things that we'll see in just a bit. But the plugin adds a bean called Spring Security Service to the Spring application context. So almost everyone said that you're familiar with the Spring framework. So most of you are probably familiar with interacting with Spring from a Java application, where you often might create an instance of the Spring application context and retrieve beans from the context, maybe by name or by type. All Grails artifacts, like controllers, participate in dependency injection, and in particular, they participate in auto-wire by name. And what that means is if there's a property in a domain class, or in any Grails artifact, like sfdemo. I've declared a property now called sfdemo. If there's a bean in the Spring application context whose name is sfdemo, that bean will be injected into that property before any of my code executes. So as I said, it turns out that the Spring Security plugin adds a bean to the Spring application context called Spring Security Service. So if I declare a property with that name, that bean will automatically be injected into this controller before any of my code executes. And so far, the only place we're using that is on line 18 here, where I'm referring to Spring Security Service.principal.id. So one of the things that Spring Security Service bean has is a property called principal, and that contains information about the currently authenticated user, whoever is currently logged in, right? So I'm going to grab the currently authenticated person and ask for their ID, and use that as an argument to person.get. Person.get is another one of those methods that don't exist in your domain class, at least not in the source code, but it exists on all of your domain classes, and it accepts. So what this call to person.get is going to do is it's going to send a query to the database to retrieve the person whose ID is this, right? Spring Security Service.principal.id. That will be the ID of the currently authenticated user. And in Groovy, I should point out, return statements are optional in Groovy. So we could put the return there, but it doesn't have to be there. So what this method is going to return is the person whose ID matches the currently authenticated user. So when we fill out that form and click Update Status, this Update Status code gets executed. Line 10 creates a new status object. Line 11 initializes the author property. Line 12 saves that object to the database. And then we'll get to lines 13 and 14 in just a minute. But notice that there are 3 properties in our status class. Right? There is message, author, and date created, but we're only initializing author and message on lines 10 and 11. We're not initializing date created. It turns out that date created is a special property that means something special to Gorm. Gorm is the ORM part of Grails that's built on top of Hibernate. And Gorm does a whole lot of interesting things by convention, but one thing in particular that relates to this code is if there's a property in a domain class called date created, and it's of type java.util.date, then when you create an instance of this domain class and save it to the database, Gorm will automatically initialize that property to be right now. That is, whatever time that object was initially saved to the database. So as I said before, when you post a message to our Twitter application, there are 3 pieces of information that we need to track. The message itself, who wrote the message, and when it was created. We have to explicitly initialize message and author, but Gorm is going to initialize that date created property for us. All right, I need to fill in this current user timeline method here. User. There we go, that's the wrong one. All right. Current user timeline. All right, what this method should do is return all of the status messages that the current user has posted. I was going to type this out. Rather than do that, I will go find the name of the snippet that I couldn't find just now. It is not current user timeline. All right, we'll use the long version and I'll just delete some code. This is what I'm actually after right here. All right, so what that is doing is sending a query to the database to retrieve all the messages that have been posted by the currently authenticated user. And I've got, there we go, that looks better. Perfect. All right, so I'm invoking a method called withCriteria on the status class. So status.withCriteria, and I'm passing a block of code as an argument to that withCriteria method. That block of code is going to get executed in a special context within Grails, and that will result in a Hibernate query being sent to the database. So the criteria that are part of this query is this query is going to return all the status objects that have an author, right? That's this bit here, that have an author whose username is equal to this. So we need to initialize PER equals current lookup person is what I want there. There we go. So I want to look up the current user, who's currently authenticated. I want to retrieve all the status objects that have an author whose username is equal to that person's username. I want no more than 10 status objects to be returned, because this user might have 10 million status objects in the database, but I don't want to render 10 million status objects on a page. And so I want no more than 10, and I want them to be sorted by the date created property, and I want them sorted descending. So the effect there is I'm going to get the 10 most recent messages posted by the currently authenticated user, is what that's going to return. Right? That query is going to return up to 10 status messages, and it's the 10 status messages that the most recent status messages posted by the currently authenticated user. All right, so the method that starts on line 17 sends a query to the database, returns a bunch of status objects, and we're using the result of that to initialize this messages variable on line 13, and then doing something on line 14 that we'll get to in just a minute. All right, let me, I'm sorry, say that again? I do, that's right. Good catch. All right, I just typed, I need to fill in about 8 lines of code here, and then we're going to have some interesting things to talk about. I'm going to create a new file here. Message template is good. We're going to get back to that. And I want to put some code.
Question?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Where did you configure the database?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Very much.
So the question was, where was the database configured, right? So we'll take a quick field trip to address that. So under Grails App /conf, there are a number of configuration files. One of them is called datasource.groovy. And datasource.groovy is where you configure information about the data source that your application is going to connect to. So at lines 1 through 6, we're defining some properties that we're going to use to connect to the database. So we want to use a pooled connection. The JDBC driver we want to use is org.hsqldb.jdbc driver. The username is SA, and the password is an empty string. So HSQL is an all Java embeddable relational database that's bundled with Grails. And it's fantastic for the kind of application that we're building right now, at least in our development environment. You certainly don't have to use HSQL. It's just bundled with Grails if you want to use it. If you wanted to use Oracle, you would change this to be Oracle's JDBC driver and so forth, but stand by on that just a minute. So we've declared some properties up at the top, and notice here, starting at line 13, there are 3 environments defined. There's a development environment, a test environment, and a production environment. When you run your application by typing Grails space run-app, which is what I've been doing, your application is running in development mode. And one of the things that means is this is the data source configuration that will be used, right? The development data source. And the way this works is all of the properties that are declared up here are effectively inherited into this block, and then the block can add new properties or replace values for properties that were inherited. So the JDBC URL that we're using here is jdbc:/hsqldb:/mem, and the mem part is important there. HSQL supports, it's an all Java embeddable database, but it supports an all in-memory database, and that's what the MEM means, which is really, really nice for your development environment. It means you don't have to monkey with managing a database. Schema is just created dynamically on the fly. One problem or one limitation with an all in-memory database is it's all in memory. So as soon as you stop the application, the database is gone forever because it's only in memory. It's not being written to the file system. That might be fine for your development environment, but probably not fine for your production environment. You can't have your database disappear every time you stop the application. That's a way to meet your DBAs maybe. But that's probably not what you want for your production environment. Down here in your production data source, notice we're also using JDBC::HSQLDB:, but instead of an in-memory database, we're using a file system database. That's what the file : and then some other HSQL specific properties there are. Line 29 is something you're almost always going to change. All over the place, Grails imposes sensible defaults to minimize the amount of configuration work that you've got to do. But there is no sensible default that we could possibly provide for your production database. You're going to have to fill in your production database information. So you're almost always going to change line 29 there to point to MySQL or Oracle or whatever database you want your application to communicate with. But this file is used to configure the data source that will be underneath everything that GORM does. All right, let me get back here. All right, let's see what state our application is in right now. Before I start it up, I'm going to make one more change. So in the beginning, when I installed the security plugin and I added a few lines to my config.groovy, I said we'd get back to this. These 3 or 4 lines right here are what I added. There are lots of ways to configure the Spring Security plugin. This is just one of them, and there's a whole lot. I don't want to go too far down the Spring Security path. I just want to point out just enough to support what we need to do here. But this is one way to tell the Spring Security plugin some rules about how you want to carry out, what kind of restrictions you want imposed on your application with respect to security. What is authenticated anonymously means is, so notice over here on the left, we've got a URI, /login/**, and here is /logout/**. What that says is in order to access any URL that matches one of those patterns, the user has to satisfy this condition. And is authenticated anonymously means that they don't have to be logged in. I'm going to add another security constraint here that says anytime someone accesses something under status, that they have to be logged in. So I'm going to say is authenticated fully. I just now added line 97. And what will happen now, the next time I start up the app, and I'll go ahead and do that now, Grails run app, anytime a request is sent to /status/anything, the Spring Security plugin will intercept that request and make sure that the user has been authenticated. And if they haven't, they'll be redirected to the login page, which is what we want in this case. So we've started the application back up. Let's see what we've got. So I'm going to click on this link right here, and what should happen is I'm redirected to the login page because of that rule we just expressed. Right? The rule says anytime someone tries to access /status/something, make sure they're logged in. So I'm going to log in. There we go. And I'm going to add a little bit of code to a page here. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but what I do want to do, Twitter site mesh. There we go. The details of what I just did, code-wise, are not terribly important. I'll point out what's important in the user interface. What I just did was I added some code that makes that happen. It says, welcome, Jeff. We're going to get to a point later where I'm going to have 2 browsers, and I'm going to have 2 different users logged into each of them, and we need to know which user is in which browser. This code right here, where's it at? That bit right there is rendering the username of the currently authenticated user. That's what the sec:/logged in user info tag does. And I'll make one more change here. I'm just going to add some CSS. There we go. All right. We didn't miss anything important or exciting there. I just needed to get a couple of things in place. All right. So now if I were to type J1 and click update status, we get no such property class for status controller. I know why that is. Right here, I'm referring to the person class someplace, right there. In my controller, I'm referring to the person class, but I forgot to import org.grails.twitter.auth.person. That should work. We'll go back here one more time, and this should work now. So that controller was just reloaded, and now it worked. All right. That doesn't, bear with me just a minute. I'm going to post J2. There we go. We see 2 messages, J1 and J2. Finally, I'll post J3. So each time I do that, a status object is being created. Jeff Brown is being associated with it. The message that I typed in is being associated with it. And the time that I created that status messages being associated with it. And that object is being stored in the database. Let's go back here. Right here, we see all those status messages showing up in the view, J1, J2, and J3. So let's review some of that GSP code that I quickly wrote before and figure out how that's happening. So lines 10 through 13 are creating that form where you can type in a status message and enter and save that status. The part that I want to talk about now starts on line 15, really line 16. Line 16 is invoking a tag called render and specifying two attributes. We're specifying a template that we want to render and a collection called messages. The template that we're rendering is called messages, this bit right here. And a file I created quickly earlier is this file right here. The file is called _messages.gsp. Understand, maybe that's kind of hard to see, but the file name is _messages.gsp. The underscore is important. The underscore is what makes this file a GSP template as opposed to a whole GSP page. A GSP template is a fragment of a GSP page, where this is a whole GSP page. It's got a head and a body and so forth. This is just a fragment of that page, right? So when the main page is rendered, I want to render this messages template, this fragment, and I want to render it over and over again, once for every element in this collection. So the collection is called messages, right? I happen to have the same name there. But that's the name of a variable that must be available when this page is rendered. The part that's highlighted right now, the collection, that's the name of a variable that must be available when this page is rendered. And where that variable came from is back here in our status controller. Notice that the index action is returning a map. So Groovy has a literal syntax for creating maps, and that's what's inside of those square brackets. So if this map had user is Jeff, town is STL, right? That's Groovy's literal syntax for creating a map. That's a java.util.linked hash map. That map now has 3 entries in it. The keys are messages, user, and town, and then the values are the things on the right side of the colons there. So I'm going to get rid of these. This map has just 1 entry in it. This is the key in the map, right? And this is the value associated with that key. And just to be clear, I'll give these 2 different names. Right? So the controller action is returning a map. There's a key in the map called messages, and the value that's associated with that key is the list of all the status messages that were returned from current user timeline. And remember what that is it's all the status messages that I have posted, the currently authenticated user. When a controller action returns a map like this, that map represents the model that's being passed into the view. So all of the keys in this map, so there's only one, it's called messages, all of those keys are available inside the view, which is why this works. So that's going to evaluate to the list of status messages that were returned from that method call. And what the render tag is going to do is it's going to render this template over and over again, once for every element in this collection. So there's quite a bit of stuff going on there, but there's really only one line of GSP code that's making it all happen. We're invoking the render tag. We're telling it to render this template once for every element in this collection. And if we look at the template, what it's doing is rendering the user's name, the user's real name. That's the Jeff Brown part. It says Jeff Brown said something. And the something is the message that's associated with the status object, which is where this came from. Jeff Brown said J3, and Jeff Brown said J2. And then below that, we see this is the code that's rendering the date that that status message was created. Right, so we've got this template that represents how I want to render a status message on a page. And that template's being rendered over and over again, once for every element in this list. Yeah, so we're talking about how wide is the column that property is being stored in. Yeah, so by default, all of your string properties are mapped to varchar 255s. And if you wanted to map it to a column of a different width, there's a way to express that. But by default, that property will be stored. There is a default, and it's a 255 character. I guess it's not always a varchar. So Hibernate has dialects for all the databases that it supports. So Hibernate asks a particular dialect, hey, if you were going to store a string in the database, what type would that column be? And for most databases, it's going to be a varchar. But for some databases, it might be a text or something else. But the default width will be 255. All right. So when I fill out this form and click Update Status, what I want to happen is I want that to be an AJAX request. I want to make the request, get this response, and use this response to update just this part of the page down here. Right? That's not what's happening right now. Right now, we're sending a request, we're getting a response, and the response is what you see in the browser. So I want to make that an AJAX request. And we'll see that we're going to be able to get that AJAX request working front to back without writing any JavaScript at all. In fact, we've only got to add one more line to our application to make that work. And I'll add that line right now, and then we'll see it work, and then I'll back up and talk about what it is that I just did. All right, so now if I were to type J6, update status, that was an AJAX request, and this part down here was updated. Watch closely, I'm going to type J7, enter J7. So we're making an AJAX request every time I click that button. We're getting a response, and the response is being used to update just this part of the page. Remember early on I said that the form remote tag is used to create an AJAX form, but initially we were seeing that I was not making an AJAX request. It was a regular HTTP request. And the reason for that is I hadn't pulled the JavaScript library into this page that can be used to manage all those AJAX requests. If we view the source of this page, pull this up a little bit, we'll see in the head of the page, see if I can adjust this. I'm dealing with resolution issues here. There we go. Right here, that code is pulling the prototype JavaScript library into this page. That is happening because of this line in my GSP right there. I'm telling Grails I want to pull the prototype JavaScript library into this page. So that resulted in this being in the generated HTML. And then if we scroll down further, there's a bunch of JavaScript down here that is associated with this form. So when I fill out the form and click Update Status, this JavaScript is being executed. The JavaScript is making the AJAX request, getting the response, and doing something with the response. But all of that JavaScript was generated by this form remote tag. Right? We didn't have to write any of that AJAX code. The form remote tag generates all of that code. Yeah. So one of the attributes that is specified on this form remote tag is the update tag. So update equals messages. This could be anything. I'll give this a different name. We'll call that message list. What that value is used for is that tells the form remote tag, when you get a response, update the div in the document with in the DOM with that ID, message list. So there happens to be a div down here with that name. But this is how you tell the form remote tag what to do with the response. So if I change this, put some gibberish there, say J8. We don't see J8 anyplace because there is no div whose name is message list. But if I change this to be message list, now we should be in business. J9 works, right? So this is how you tell the form remote tag what to do with the response. There's one little thing I don't like about our form right now. So if I type J10, update status, I want to clear this J10 out of here, right? After I submit the form. So we'll write just a small bit of JavaScript. I'll say on success equals document.update status form .message.value equals empty string. Let's see if that worked. To do with the response. That worked. One little thing about our form that worked. So if I type status, clear this J out of here. Right? After the form, I'll write just a bit of JavaScript. On equals doc is handling this form. Just very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but we'll take a quick look at what our schema looks like. So at the top of my project, I've typed Grails schema-export. And what schema-export is going to do is generate a file that shows me what my DDL looks like. And there we go, that's done. We'll take a quick look. So this is DDL that is consistent with the schema that Gorm expects to be in the database right now. We'll see that a status object, the status table I should say, has, where's it at? Right there. There's an author ID column in the status table, and that's a foreign key that points to the person object, to the person table. that right? Yeah, that points to the person table. So the person table has an ID column, right? That's the primary key. And in the status table is a column called author_ID. That's the foreign key that points to the person table. Right, and if we go back to our status.groovy, we've expressed that a status has a person associated with it. So by default, we'll get a foreign key from the status table that points to the person. Yes, we're talking about validating properties in domain classes. Grails has a really, is that what you're talking about? Yeah, Grails has a really sophisticated validation system in place. We can do things like, I can say that the message has to be at least 2 characters and no more than 141. We're way better than Twitter. Twitter limits you to 140. We've got 141. I could say that the message has to match some regular expression. We'll say that it has to begin with an upper. There's all kinds of rules I could express here. I don't want to go too far down that path. But so we provided a place for you to express rules about what are the valid values for properties in a domain class. And any place in your application where you create a status and try to save it, these rules are carried out. So for example, if you created a status that violated this rule, if you created a status whose message did not begin with an uppercase J, Gorm will prevent that object from being saved to the database. You'll get errors will be populated on your domain object. There's a way to render there's a lot more to that than I want to get into right now. But there's a declarative way for you to express what are the valid values for properties in a domain class. And those rules are imposed any place in your application where you try to save an instance of this class. Yeah, so when you express relationships between classes, which in fact we're going to do a little bit of that right now. So right now, I'm not abandoning your question, I promise. We're going to circle right back around to this. Right now, what we've got in our application is I can create status objects, post them, and I can render. I can see my own status messages. But in Twitter, you want to be able to follow other people, right? Express that anytime Jeff posts a message to Twitter, I want to know about it. So let's add some of that capability to our class, to our application, and that's going to help us address the question that just came up. All right, so I've just added line 12 to the person class. Remember that the person class represents a person in our application, right? So a person has a real name, a username, a password, a number of other properties. And on line 12, what I've expressed is that a person has many other persons associated with it, and this is just the name of a property that will be added to this class. Let me try to clarify that. Line 14 happens to this class because of line 12. So what happens is a set with this name is added to the class, and it will be a set of these objects, right? It'll be a set of person objects. So I don't need to declare that. Gorm will add that property to this class automatically. So I'm expressing a relationship between persons and persons in this case. So I'm saying a person has many other persons associated with it, and I want to store those persons in a collection called followed. That's going to be, what I'm using that collection for is I want to keep track of all the people that I'm following. So every person has a list of people associated with them. Let's say that a person also had a list of statuses associated with it. Right? So I can put as many entries in this map as I like. If in the status class, this wouldn't even make sense for our model, but in the status class I could say something like this. I could say that a status belongs to a person. And one of the things that means is that if a person is deleted, I want all of his status messages to be deleted as well. Right? So there are two pieces to this. One, in the person class, I've expressed that a person has many statuses. Right? And then in the status class, I've expressed that a status belongs to a person. And by default, that will cascade deletes. So if I delete a person, all of his statuses will be deleted. Turns out we're not modeling our relationship that way. A person doesn't have many statuses. Every status has one person, which is represented on line 8 here. So I've said that a person has many persons associated with it. I want to be able to keep track of relationships between a person and all the people that that person is following, all the people that I want to be notified of when those people post new messages to Twitter. Let me add another thing here. I'll say searchable equals only real name. We'll get back to that in just a minute. I'm going to go to the top of my application, and I'm going to install a plugin called Searchable. I'm going to add a search form We're going to review all of this, I promise, in just a minute. New folder, searchable. All right, we're going to come back to all that code in just a moment. I want to start the application back up and see what we've got so far. So the code changes that I made in the person class are lines 12 and 13. Line 12 says that every person has a bunch of other persons associated with it. And line 13 has to do with some search capabilities that we're going to get to as soon as I can get our application back up and running. All right, the Spring Security plugin is being configured right now. Our users are created. We're using an in-memory database. Remember that the default database configuration for your development environment is in memory. So all of my status messages are going to be gone now. We'll see when I log in, Jeff, password. I've got no status messages, J1 and J2, so forth. All right, but so we've got some new information up at the top of this page. Search for people to follow, and there's a form there. Let's see where that came from. So I added this code right here to our main JSP. It just puts a heading up there that says search for people to follow. Then I'm creating a form. That's not an AJAX form. It's just a regular form, an HTML form, that is submitting to a controller called Searchable. And there is no Searchable controller in our application, but or there kind of is. I installed the Searchable plugin into our app, and that plugin contributes a controller called Searchable, and that controller does some interesting things. Let's see what happens. If I type Graham in here and press enter, what's showing up in this list is all the people in the database that satisfy that search criteria. So it turns out there's only one Graham in our database, that's who's represented here. If I click this link, that's a 404 right now, but what I want to happen when I click that link is I want that person to be added to my list, the list of people that I follow. Right? So Graham Roche is one person, Jeff Brown's another person. I've logged in as Jeff Brown. I've searched for users, and Graham Roche is one of the users that satisfied my search criteria. So I want to tell Twitter, hey, I want to follow that person. Click that link. That link is right here. This is the page that's rendering my search results. So this is iterating through all of the elements in this collection, which is created by the Searchable plugin. That's a list of all the persons that satisfied my search criteria. For every one of them, I'm going to render this link that leads to the follow action in the status controller. And there is no follow action in the status controller right now, and that's why we're getting a 404 here. But let's implement that follow action. There we go. So when the follow action is executed, what we're going to do is send a query to the database to retrieve the user that I want to follow. That's what line 15 is doing. Line 16 is just verifying that we really did find a person. If we did find a person, look me up, that's the currently authenticated user, and add the person that we just searched for to my list, to the list of people that I follow. That's what this line right here is doing. That's going to add Graham to the list of people that I follow, right? Then I want to save the current user. I want to save me because I want those, the fact that I'm following him to be represented in the persisted to the database, right? And then redirect to the index action. Go back to where we started. So let's verify that that works. Say Graham, search for Graham, follow him. We think we're following him, but we can't tell so far. Let's start up another browser. And over here, I'm going to log in as Graham. So we see welcome Graham up at the top. Hopefully we can keep track of who's who. I'm going to post that's not right. I'm going to post G1, update status, G2, update status. So Graham's posted several messages to the database. We see G1 and G2 there. If we go back to me, I'm following Graham. So the idea is we should see not only my messages down here, but also Graham's messages. But we're not seeing them. I'm refreshing the page, and I only see J1 and J2. Does anyone know what the problem is right now? Yeah.
You're only showing your own messages in the
That's right. This query is only retrieving the messages posted by me. We need to extend that a little bit to retrieve all the messages posted by me and the people that I follow. Watch this. We'll say def per equals lookup person. Bear with me here. We'll step back through this as soon as I can get it typed in. If per.followed All right, so I've added some code to our criteria here. Remember that the idea here is we're trying to send a query to the database to retrieve a bunch of status messages. I want to retrieve all the status messages whose author has a username that's equal to the username of the currently authenticated user, or the status message was posted, or the status message has an author that is in this list. So per.followed is the list of people that I follow. Remember that per is me. Right? That's the currently authenticated user. Per.followed is the list of all the people that I follow. So, and notice this is inside of an OR block. So all of these conditions are ORed together. This says retrieve status messages whose author's username is equal to this, or the status message has an author that is in this list, people that I follow. So let's see if that works. And it should. There we go. So now I'm seeing G1 and G2. I'm seeing messages posted by Graham because I follow him. It is, in fact, doing a join. And you get to configure, there's more to configuring relationships than I've bothered to talk about here, and I don't want to go too far down that path. But you can control things like whether there's a join table or whether there's just a foreign key from one table to another. You get to control how that's represented in your persistence model. Absolutely, Groovy supports exception handling in a way that's far superior to the way Java deals with the exceptions. So exception handling works a lot like it does in Java. You can write try-catch blocks, and they work the same way they do in Java. The difference between Groovy's exception management and Java's is in Groovy, there's no such thing as a checked exception. Everything is a runtime exception. Even checked exceptions are runtime exception. Everything's a runtime exception from Groovy's perspective. That's almost true. Yeah, so almost all valid Java syntax is valid Groovy syntax. There are a couple little exceptions. But if there's something you know how to do in Java, and you don't know how to do that thing in Groovy, you can do it the Java way in your Groovy source file, and you'll almost always get away with that. Groovy, almost all valid Java syntax is valid Groovy syntax. Yeah, it's a good question. So how does the performance of a Grails application compare to a standard Spring Hibernate application? That's the question, right? There is, so we could talk for a long time about this, but I'll resist that. The short answer is that Groovy is not as fast as Java, and it can't be as fast as Java because Groovy is doing everything that Java does, plus a whole bunch of other, a bunch more. So Groovy is slower than Java, and depending on what you're doing, maybe it's a little bit slower, maybe it's more than a little bit slower. But Groovy is more than fast enough for building business applications. We don't have performance problems with building business apps. So you're not going to write sort of real-time air traffic control stuff with Groovy. You're not going to do that with Java either, by the way. But for building business applications, the performance difference between Groovy and Java, between well-written Groovy and Java, for almost all applications is not a problem. We don't have problems. We don't have situations where folks are building applications with Groovy and with Grails and running into a serious performance problem. So for the occasions when I have seen Grails applications that have performance problems, it's a poorly written application that would have the same performance problems no matter what framework they were using. But there are things to know about, you really need to understand the Groovy programming language and how things work at runtime in Groovy, because there are things you can do that can cost you performance, and there are things that you can do to buy yourself performance. There's just a whole lot more to that than we can get into in the negative 2 minutes that I've got left today. Yeah, so we've spent an hour and a half. I've done a lot of talking, but just to sort of review how much code we've got, most of our code is right here in this controller, and I've got 54 lines in the source file, and depending on what you're counting, maybe there's 30 or 40 lines of code there. There's not a whole lot of code there. Here's our person domain class. There's not very much code there. You'll write far less code in a Grails application than you will in a corresponding Java web app. And the same is true, so never mind web applications, just any Java application. If you were to write the same application with Groovy, you'll write considerably less Groovy code than you would write Java code. Developer productivity is a huge win for both Groovy and Grails in particular. Grails applications are, the developer productivity gains that Grails has to offer are just more than significant. That's a really, really big deal for Grails, is developer productivity. So if you wanted to deploy to Jetty instead of Tomcat, so I should clarify that when I type Grails run app, what happens is an instance of Tomcat is started up, and that's what's used for our development environment. If I were to type Grails war, what happens is Grails is going to create a war file that has everything my application needs at runtime. And I can take that war file and I can deploy it to TC Server or Tomcat or Jetty or any reasonable servlet container. I don't need a servlet container that has support for Grails. There's really no such thing. It's just a Java web app by the time the servlet container sees it. So this war file that was just created, I can take that war file and drop it into Jetty, as you said, or TC Server or any servlet container. We bundle Tomcat with Grails to make it very, very easy for you to run your application in development in your development environment. You just type Grails run app. You don't have to configure Tomcat or Jetty or anything. That doesn't mean you have to deploy to Tomcat. Yeah, JRuby is really a language, and Grails is a framework for building web apps. JRuby is really about bringing Ruby to the JVM, right? Groovy is a dynamic language that has a lot of things in common with Ruby. Groovy was designed to run on the JVM from the very beginning. It's not the case that we had to port Groovy or write a JRuby kind of thing for Groovy. Groovy was designed to run on the JVM from the very beginning. And because of that, we get really, really seamless interoperability with Java. The Java interop story for Groovy, I think, is far better than the JRuby interop story with Java. They've done fantastic work on JRuby to bring Ruby to the JVM, and they've got good stuff in place to support Java interop, but the Groovy to Java interop story is far better than the Ruby to Java interop story. Yeah, so what if you wanted to reuse common code across Grails applications? Is that what we're talking about? You've got a number of options depending on what it is you're trying to share and some other factors. Maybe what you want to do is you want to write a Grails plugin that contains those things you want to share, just like I've installed the Searchable plugin and the security plugin. Another thing you might do is just, if the things you want to share are not really Grails artifacts, it's just code, a bunch of classes that do something that you want to share across applications. You can share that across Grails applications the same way you would share it across any Java applications. So one of your options is to put those classes in a jar file, and at the top of your Grails project is a directory called lib, and it's empty by default. But you can drop jar files into that lib directory, and just their presence in that lib directory makes them part of your app. So you don't have to monkey with a project file or a class path or anything. Just drop jar files in that directory, and all the classes that are in those jar files will be available to your application. So depending on what it is you're trying to share, you might want to jar those classes up and put them in the lib directory. You might want to make those classes part of a Grails plugin, or maybe you want the stuff that you're trying to share, make it an application of its own, and then send remote requests to that application using RMI or SOAP or whatever. Yeah, so what about Maven integration is the question. So there's a Grails plugin for Maven, and just about everything you can do from the command line with Grails, like Grails space run app and Grails space war, there are corresponding Maven goals. So once you've installed the Grails Maven plugin, you would type mvn space Grails run app or Grails war. So we've got good Maven support if you really want to build your application, your Grails application with Maven.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.